Thank you all for being in attendance, and thank you very much to the two speakers who preceded me. They've anticipated much of what I've had to say, so I will attempt to not tread upon the ground that they've already covered. I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that were raised in the concluding moments of the previous presentation, the whole question of resistance to police violence, and I think some very viable proposals were articulated by my colleague who just spoke. I want first of all to put forth a bit of a caveat, or I think an important note with respect to how we conceptualize police violence. It's often seen in this sort of raw, explicit, quotidian terms, captured by shootings and beatings, and with the use of all of the various instruments of violence that are at the disposal of the police. But there are, of course, different ways of thinking about violence. And when we look at the facts of containment in the context of a social order in which some people are confined to spaces characterized by very truncated life chances, the role of the police becomes very pertinent in that regard. And so I just want to read a brief quote here by, I don't know if I'd characterize this individual as an important thinker, but I'll quote this individual anyway. You take a community with a lack of infrastructure, no support systems, and lots of young people being left to their own devices, and you're going to have problems. Some of these high-density, subsidized housing developments do nothing but warehouse people. They ghettoize people. This has been a big problem in Toronto and in many other cities as well, and the inevitable results are tragic for everyone. These things were built for a disaster. So we had the invocation of warehousing, of ghettoization, and the speaker, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, is an individual commonly known or formerly known as Toronto's top cop, Julian Fantino, in his 2007 book entitled Duty, the Life of a Cop. So it's a very self-serving book. It should be really called How to Turn Canada into a Police State in 12 Easy Steps. Because if you read the book, it's all about, it's just a constant reiteration of the idea that police power should be constantly expanded, and any mechanisms that may be ostensibly dedicated to enforcing accountability should be accordingly attenuated. But it's an interesting book. If you do a sort of an against the grain, counter-hegemonic reading of that book, you can pull out a few gems here and there. So Fantino, of course, despite his recognition of the salience of ghettoization and warehousing, obviously doesn't take the further analytical step of talking about the role of the police in buttressing spatial confinement through various means of containment. But this sort of again, these structural contexts in which truncated life chances are the norm are very much reinforced by the everyday patterns of policing with which many of us are so familiar, the microaggression, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a thinker by the name of Waddington out of the UK stated it very succinctly. He stated that policing is inextricably tied to social exclusion. So I just want to make a note of the fact that in terms of my conception of police violence is much broader than the standard ways in which it's thought of. But I'll be getting. I just want to make that note. In terms of I think some of the approaches. I'm not going to pitch this at a very high degree of specificity because I think that's been done very effectively by the previous speakers, as well as Brother Ajamu, who recently did a piece for Counterpunch entitled, what's the title of it?
On police violence.
On police violence.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and Brother Ajamu has done a good job of getting into the role of I guess, legal strategies, videotaping, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk about sort of three approaches that are basically concordant with what Brother Ajamu has already noted in his interesting piece in Counterpunch. I want to talk, first of all, very briefly about the logic of raising social costs as a means to combat police violence. I also want to touch briefly upon the role of contending with what I refer to as enabling institutions, those kindred institutions that are part and parcel of the ways in which the police are able to operate, the ways in which they're able to paper over their everyday oppressive practices, et cetera, et cetera. And I also want to talk about the possibility, at least at a speculative level, of internationalizing the struggle against police violence in this setting. It goes without saying that Canada isn't a hermetically sealed realm of 35 million people, but that we live in a broader world, and perhaps we can establish some ties with progressive forces in other parts of the world in order to bolster our efforts against police violence. I think that when I talk about this whole question of raising social costs, some of you will be very familiar with Michael Albert, who is, I guess, I don't know his formal title, but the chief administrator of ZNet, very indispensable website. And in many of his talks, he talks about the ways in which oppressive power can be most effectively counteracted. And he invokes this idea of raising social costs in order to counter the notion that somehow or another oppression can be combated or attenuated by making moral appeals to those who are engaged in the oppression. And he says, as a matter of fact, that you're dealing with beings and institutions who are eminently amoral, and as a result of that, the only thing that can disrupt the cost-benefit analyses in which they engage is by raising social costs. In other words, if they're engaged in a particular set of social practices, how can the cost of those practices be raised to the point where those practices are no longer so beneficial to them? And he talks about that in the context of the war in Vietnam. In the context of policing, there are some fairly interesting examples of the ways in which that logic plays itself out. I know that in the 1990s, in various parts of Brazil, such as Rio, the favela residents, in response to the constant police violence to which they're subjected, employed a number of strategies, ways in which they could raise social costs, one of which included sort of marching out of the favelas into the city core where the affluent people reside, and basically marching and chanting, et cetera, disrupting the usual order of things for those who are commonly regarded as their social betters. And in response to that, you had these affluent segments of the population going to the police and saying that you really need to do something about this. When you go up into the favelas and brutalize these people, they're coming down, in a sense, taking their frustrations out on us. And it's not I'm not suggesting at all that put a serious dent in the police violence, which is part and parcel of the lives of people in the slums of Rio, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just pointing out that they were employing this logic of raising social costs, and then it's another question of the extent to which it was actually effective. Certainly the idea of raising social costs was very well understood by the members of the Black Panther Party, who certainly weren't going to stoop to the level of trying to make moral appeals to those who were murdering members of the black community in Oakland and throughout the United States. But I think that's, in terms of how that sort of approach can be implemented within this setting, and what sort of viable strategies might flow from it, that's something that we might want to discuss in the course of our breakout groups. Also, I think, and this has been touched upon by previous speakers to a certain extent, there's a need to, of course, not compartmentalize this issue as if somehow or another the police are the sole locus of the problem. Think that we see here in Toronto there are a host of what I call enabling institutions which are heavily implicated in the patterns of violence and oppression that with which we're so familiar. So in that specific regard, some of the culprits that are readily identifiable include the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which has established these wonderful partnerships with the police in order to enforce laws against trespassing. And we saw some very explicit instances of the degree to which the Toronto Community Housing Corporation is really walking hand in hand with the police. Some of you are very familiar with the case of the Neptune 4 over by Neptune Drive, where there was 4 young men doing nothing more than walking down the street of their own neighborhood, and the police wound up confronting them. They wound up initiating an incident in which a young man was punched in the face and a gun was pulled on his 2 friends, and a whole battery of criminal charges were levied against them. Of course, there was a video that came out, which was available on the Toronto Star website and presumably on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. And in response to that, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation reprimanded and in fact fired some of the workers who stood in solidarity with the young men and their families in response to that. So it says quite a bit, and it's very interesting because the Toronto Community Housing Corporation said that by aligning themselves with the individuals who were victimized, they were somehow violating, the appropriate ways in which they should be behaving towards the residents. There was some sort of conflict of interest between the residents and these workers, and they sort of, that was what resulted from that. But it's very revealing that the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, even in the wake of that incident, was very quick to again reiterate the wonderful relationship they have with the police and how they want to move forward in a positive fashion. And it's sort of just add parenthetically that it speaks to the degree to which these surveillance cameras, which are supposedly put in place for the purpose of public safety, are in fact anything but. Because if you're beaten to death by the police in full view of one of these cameras, all of a sudden the tape disappeared, the camera wasn't functioning, et cetera, et cetera. Junior Manning was beaten in full view of closed circuit television cameras on the north side of York University campus, and for some, I guess, not so inexplicable reason, that those security images were never released. So Toronto Community Housing Corporation, the Toronto District School Board certainly comes into play, of course, with again the notion of partnerships between the school board and the police, where police officers are in schools. If you sort of dig and read some of the material that's been produced by the TDSB, they speak about the role of the police in showing young people how to be good citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that sort of ideological work, really that sort of indoctrination, which I think needs to be attacked, because the consciousness of young people is being shaped in very pernicious ways by the Toronto District School Board. And again, I conceive of them as an enabling institution. So very interesting that the TDSB doesn't seem to make any allowances for people who stand in diametric opposition to the police to come in and speak. The police have hundreds of opportunities a year to come in and speak to young people in individual classes or in school assemblies. I don't think you'll find any of our speakers here being invited to by the TDSB anytime soon. And again, it's so we're dealing with indoctrination rather than education. I think those are some of the institutions that we need to target in the course of combating police violence, insofar as they enable such violence in a whole host of ways. And certainly the SIU, with their 99% exoneration rate, they have to come in for some serious criticism. And I would add that a lot of times when we talk about SIU investigations, we think about shootings and beatings. A lot of the sexual violence that the police direct towards women should also be taken into account. I would encourage each and every one of you to go onto the SIU website and look at the occurrence charts. And when you see the charts that they have for sexual assault, you'll see that 98% of the time officers are cleared in those instances as well. And I guess the flip side of that is somehow or another that women are constantly lying about being sexually assaulted by the police. So that's one of the dimensions that we should also bear in mind when we talk about police violence. I think on an international level, there are also certain possibilities for pitching the struggle at such a level. There was a time, for example, in the 1980s, in response to a series of shootings of black men in Toronto, when the Jamaican consulate actually intervened and got in touch with high-ranking officials in Ottawa to express their displeasure in response to those shootings. And there is perhaps some evidence that, at the very least, Canadian political elites found that somewhat disconcerting, for what that's worth. Also, the United Nations has written a variety of reports on racial discrimination in Canada, dealing with that generally, and more specifically, there are subsections on policing in those reports. Why not try to bring UN monitors to this country pursuant to the relevant international agreements to which Canada is a signatory? Maybe they can monitor the degree to which Canada is violating those agreements. As well, there are certain broadcast opportunities that we might avail ourselves of in other nations. There are, for example, some First Nations activists in Toronto who have traveled to Iran to speak on Press TV, and they have some, that is, as you can imagine, within the mainstream press, that was regarded as a very contentious measure. But it's quite interesting that First Nations activists have to perhaps travel all the way to Iran in order to get a fair hearing on a major broadcast station. So I do think, however, that we should explore possibilities for internationalizing the struggle, especially since Toronto and Canada more generally is home to so many diasporic peoples. More generally, I think there's, of course, a need to be very critical of policing per se. If the social order in which we live is fundamentally unjust, and the primary role of the police is to uphold this social order, then policing in and of itself is fundamentally objectionable. I remember a few years ago attending a conference that was there was a speaker from UC Berkeley, who now is a professor at UC Irvine by the name of Dylan Rodriguez. And he sat there at the conclusion of his talk. He says, you know, we're very critical of police brutality, but we're not critical of policing, right? We act as if the police weren't, you know, shooting people and beating people, somehow or another, all would be fine. But the everyday, unremarkable patterns of day-to-day policing that we see in this city play an indispensable role in the reproduction of this social order that I regard as rather odious, and I assume many of you do as well. So that's all I have to say. I hope I didn't even look to see if I went over time, but okay. Thank you very much.
So the first summary of the first breakout group is going to be the research and the law and strategy conversation.
Particularly situations like carding and illegal stops and searches by police have resulted in charges, false charges being laid. And you, sort of like the Neptune 4, that's the classic case in Toronto, but other emerging cases like that. Some of folks might have heard about the recent stop and search decision in New York City, where a judge finally and correctly, we think, named the police as breaking their own laws when they stopped and search racialized folks, working class folks without any probable cause in their own neighborhoods. So research that decision and see how we can use that in a legal strategy here in Ontario. Research Bill C-10 and its effects on communities. That's a bill, the omnibus crime bill, that includes certain provisions, particularly affecting people who are on parole or released from federal time. Speaking out about the Public Works Protection Act being used as a tool of surveillance at courthouses and other locations. We wanted to start to develop some Know Your Rights trainings that were really practical, that wouldn't just give people an idea that these rights that the government say they've given us, that have actually been the fruit of struggle, of community struggle, and wrested from the hands of the government, that those rights actually don't mean a whole lot when you're encountering the police in our neighborhoods, in our communities, because the police tend to write their own law when they're the only arbiter with the monopoly on the use of force. So we wanted to have really good political and legal trainings around that. There was some discussion about the existing mechanisms for police accountability, like the Office of the Independent Police Review Director and the Human Rights Tribunal. Someone in the group has done some research on that and had some really important information about how the government's trying to force us into this dead end of the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, and that will then prevent you from being able to file a claim in human rights tribunals where sometimes you get a fairer hearing. We wanted to organize legal support for community mobilizations like the Black Panther Party used to do in their community defense efforts. We wanted to develop a memorandum on law around filming police so people would feel like they knew they had the right to film police. We know we do. It's there's no law against filming the police, but they're going to tell you it's illegal every time. And we wanted to give people knowledge around that in front. We wanted to build a roster of defense lawyers who would help out with the people doing police accountability work in the streets and in communities. We wanted to research the bill C-43, which is removing more of our comrades and friends who are here as permanent residents, stripping them of their residency and sending them, deporting them and exiling them from our communities. That bill is courtesy of the Harper government, and we wanted to get some more information on that impact. And then someone suggested more targeted letter writing campaigns, which we're going to consider. So the group's committed to meeting again soon. We talked about a meeting on September 21st of the network. We were realizing that's going to be the Take Back the Night March, and given Faith's really important comments about the role of women in the struggle against police violence, we might want to reconsider the date for the September meeting of the network. So we're considering changing from the 21st to the 28th. So that was the other thing that our group thought of. I see a hand up.
I don't know if it's permissible for me to ask a question.
Not right now, but after, is it like a point of information question or more of a dialogue
It's
based?
kind of, I mean, it's an information question, but also it would really be a yes or no answer.
Sure,
And it's
go ahead.
Okay, so I recently found out something really disturbing about the law, that something that cops are allowed to do in the States, and it's another side of police brutality, which is pinning trumped up and fake charges on people, and one of the ways of doing that is getting a fake confession through like intimidation, violence, and all kinds of tricks. And one thing that is legal for them to do that I found out is to say that they have evidence they don't. So they'll say, oh, you didn't do it, well, we have your fingerprints. Or we have your accomplice who said that you did it.
They can do that in Canada too,
So
unfortunately.
that's, I want to ask, that's legal.
Yeah. Cops lie.
Yeah.
So this group, I mean, initially it was going to be called Cop Watch. I actually think that like something around community organizing for the protection of communities was kind of more important. The people in the room represented a number of organizations, many of them organized labor, including Impedum, Basics, Common Front, the Network for Pan-African Solidarity. That's not all of them, but they were there. One of the themes of the discussion is that folks seem to gain a consensus that this organization, the Network for the Elimination of Police Violence, should not or is not going to take form as a mass organization, rather that it's an alliance of organizations that are doing work and convening to address police violence. Some of the project ideas that people talked about, because of the Cop Watch theme, people talked about Cop Watch, but then it was indicated very clearly that Cop Watch is useless by itself if it's not also combined with addressing horizontal violence within our communities, and then if it's not generally combined with comprehensive community organizing that's addressing all of the needs that people have in our communities. A website was mentioned, community emergency response team. So this is imagining beyond the police, imagining beyond the police state. How can our communities protect ourselves and respond to our emergencies in ways that are healthy for us? Resourcing existing programs and projects like Impedum. I think that would probably fit into something that the fundraising working group would do. Supporting justice movements forming around Justice for Sammy, and general awareness campaigns about knowing your rights, education, and about security culture. Was brought up that like these organizations, again, when they're effective, they will be subject to repression, and that people joining these organizations and doing work in these organizations need to learn how to effectively respond to people who are going to infiltrate when the police state infiltrates these organizations. We probably had some people in this room today. That this work should be combined with prison solidarity work, and that addressing mental health issues in the mental health system as an oppressive state system, is crucial to this work, and that education and community response and protection of people dealing with mental health issues, it has to be at the forefront of this work. And then also addressing police violence against houseless people, homeless folks. Am I missing?
I think the two most salient points coming out of the 35 or so people who were there, I think, was that one, a Cop Watch has to be a function of a more comprehensive organizing strategy where you're addressing all the needs of the people, security, material, and otherwise. And Cop Watch is one element of that. And that, you know, from the people that were in the room, we see that people have a lot to contribute. Most people in the room had their own experiences with police terrorism, repression, criminalization, containment, and so on. But that this particular network seems to would lend its strengths in the form of an alliance, you know, bringing together organizations, maybe individuals as well. But that doesn't, you know, there's an entirely different need for local, strong mass organizations that can serve this function among other ones to comprehensively address the needs of the people.
We combine the communication, fundraising, and education together. So some of the ideas that we came up with was to create an information database where we'll pull together information from many different sources, from YouTube videos, Twitter, photos from other spaces. Also, for us to come together and gather all of the white papers, research that have been done, and police, so that we can have it in a centralized place. But I think we should also go further than that, and also break down some of these data in terms of take out the usable and the most important elements of it as part of our propaganda work in changing people's ideas around police, essentially exposing them to the real reason for the existence of police. Also, an idea that came forward is for us to create a virtual network of websites or do website sharing, because you have a lot of groups that are doing police violence work across this country. We pull the information in a centralized place. So when someone go to, for example, our website, they would see the information there. It's a way to do the education and to put it to make information very accessible. Also, people, so we need to do outreach, and wherever we go, we try to link up people and try to encourage them into this work. A proposal that came forward, and I think it's also very important in terms of the education work that we will be doing, is for us to develop a roster of speakers who will be available to go to schools, community organizations, campuses, to educate people about this, because we can win. But we need also to change consciousness and also to lead people, hopefully inspire them into doing action. Okay, into doing action. And also, we propose to create radio programs, or to put together proposals and seek our own radio programs, or if we can't get that, to share segments on existing programs. So every week or every other week, we may have 15 minutes so we can educate the public around police violence. Police violence and also the prison industrial complex, because it's critically important for us not to separate the imprisonment and the judicial system and also the parole system. Because a lot of times we talk about the prison industrial complex, we kind of ignore the parole system as part of that structure. Yeah, and also someone was suggesting that we put together a website where we can provide videos of acts of police brutality. And as a part of trying to create this national consciousness about what the police, these agents of repression are doing, we could have a national conference that pull together forces that are organizing locally against police violence. We have a bunch of other things. Want to? No? Okay.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. Okay, so we have some other things here. Around the issue of, I don't need to talk about minority rights because it was already proposed by another group, but something that we also need to create is an activist training program. Because one thing the enemy has done, that before they train us into accepting their views of reality, we also have to train our people, not only to have the consciousness of oppression and emancipation, but also provide them with the skills to do the work. And that's critical. We have to have the skills to fight police repression and to develop an effective campaign against the prison industrial complex. So that's something that we need to do. It's also important for us to raise the issue of racialization and differential racialization in our public education campaign. Because we have to be very honest here. If Sammy Yatim's name was Tyrone Johnson, would it have generated this amount of sympathy with the same evidence? Because yes, of course he's Tyrone, and who likes Tyrone?
I think so.
You know?
I think so.
But we have to go based on the evidence. You know, when Junior Manan was killed, when Eric Wasawa was killed, where was the sympathy? We don't need a video to tell us that something is outrageous happened. But we need to look at that. And also when we look at the statistics in the city of Toronto, the police database, and who are the people that are being stopped? Africans at the top, South Asian and Arabs next, East Asian, and then whites. It's very clear. If we also talk about the imprisonment of bodies, and we look, Africans at the top, South Asian, Arabs, you know, like we have to have the difficult conversation around these things and don't pretend like these things are not happening. Because the statistics are there. And not only that, we talk about these things in our in-group. We just don't talk about it when we're in mixed situation, but we have to have those difficult conversations. These are things that when we meet, we will go through some of these things and develop the action plan about implementing these. We're going to have a flip chart.
Hold on, I'll
So,
say.
oh, you did that? Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I was taking over the AC's room.
Thanks, Ajahn. Okay, so this brings an end to this evening and this conversation and dialogues that are just beginning. I think it's important that when we leave here today, that we don't forget the urgency and the state of emergency that our communities are in. at the hands of the state and at the hands of the arms of the state, including the Police Department of Toronto. That we don't remove it also from the struggles of our comrades both in the United States and globally. This is a time where we're seeing the criminalization of dissent at all levels. A perfect example of this is the recent increased bounty of Assata Shakur, and also of her being placed on the most wanted terrorist list, the first woman to be placed on that. So I want us to be able to make these critical connections, both in our own communities, among the people in our lives, and then also in the work that we're doing, whether you're working in a community center, whether you're working in an advertising agency, whatever it is, that you're making these critical connections in your day-to-day. So that we don't lose the momentum that's happening here. There's where Andrew is, so maybe Andrew, if you can wave. There's 3 flip chart papers behind him that have, so if you're particularly interested, let's say in the community accountability and protection piece, or if you're interested in the research and legal strategy piece, or if you're interested in the communication piece, please write your name and your contact info, email, phone number, whatever the best ways to get a hold of you, and we'll ensure that we follow up with you and let you know when the next meeting for that working group is happening, so that this isn't just an empty conversation that sits here, so that these critical connections continue